All right, so I'm going to attempt to give you a really fast whirlwind of the history of documentary photography. It's going to be extremely flawed because there was a lot happening in the world of documentary photography, particularly after World War I, because photography became less specialized. A lot more people could own a camera and make photographs after World War I because of the size of cameras, which changed significantly. So we'll talk about that. So this is a very flawed overview of the history. I normally teach a history class in one full semester. So this is a really quick overview just to give you guys some context. I also think it's challenging to teach a documentary photography class when you've had no prerequisite of beginning photography. So what this class actually is a beginning photography class with assignments rooted in documentary photography and discussions and slideshows around documentary photography. At my college, documentary photography is a 3rd or 4th semester class. And we'll talk about why that is. Okay, it has to do with the investigative nature of the document and what documentary photographers do. So these are the artists that I'm going to be telling you about today. And in the early years of photography, when it was invented in 1839, there was no really such a word as documentary photography. And now we've grown into this era of new media where documentary photography exists in many, many different kinds of forms. And with the inclusion of video, there's a lot more interactive projects online, and documentary photographers are expected to do video. You'll see Ben on board. He's the ship's photographer. He is in a visual journalism program at Brooks Institute in Santa Barbara, which I happen to go to Brooks and take some classes also. But he is expected to do video and stills, and that's the new normal in terms of documentary photography. So documentary photography today means that you work on a longer term project, a place that you might go back to for many, many years. So for us, it's a challenge to create true documentary photography in this vocabulary, in this definition, because our experience will be very intense and very fast. Now, it's not impossible to create a documentary photography experience of your personal journey. That is very doable. And that's the kind of thing I'm going to encourage you to focus on, because I think that's a true 3-month investigation of your experience. Photojournalism is a little more of what we might be doing. Photojournalism refers to spot news. If you work as a photojournalist, you get an assignment, you go to the place, you might be there for a few days, you might be photographing a conflict or an event, and then you're out and you're gone, and you may never ever go back to that place again, okay? And then there's street photography. Street photography is something that we're going to be doing, and I love street photography. Street photography is very abstract. It doesn't necessarily have a story within it. It's basically light, shape, or form, photographing the fleeting moment. Or as the famous photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson says, the decisive moment, the moment in between that exists at 1/1000th of a second that you happen to capture with your camera. So the thing is that we have all these different definitions, but many photographers and many practitioners are all 3 of these things, okay? So photography was born well before the 19th century. There are many people that discovered the phenomenon all around the world, but it's Aristotle that wrote it down. So Aristotle, the philosopher 400, 500 BC, basically saw a natural forming camera. Our eyes work in the same way. So light comes through the lens of our eye, it refracts the subject upside down and backwards, and then our brain turns it right side up and right way around. The camera becomes our brain, essentially. We can create a camera in this room, which could be really fun, challenging, but fun. And I'll talk about how. So the challenge up until the 19th century was everybody could make a camera, but nobody could figure out how to get the image to stay, how to get that image fixed onto a substrate. Here's a real-life camera obscura. So camera obscura means dark room. We create a dark room for the light to pass through. And the image, it's a natural lens. So this is the contemporary artist, Abe Morell. And Abe Morell goes into hotel rooms and houses. He uses social networking to reach out to find people to help him get locations. So in this case, it's a hotel room right across from the Eiffel Tower. He's shut all the windows, covered them with black plastic, and left a hole about the size of a dime to act as the lens. If we were to see this in person, it would be very faint and hard to see, but he's using photography to intensify this phenomenon so that we can see it. And that's what his work is really about. He builds these very natural camera obscuras, and then he uses an actual camera to photograph them. And so photography was used by artists, basically two tracks. The camera obscura was used by artists who could more quickly sketch a scene, because to publish news meant that the artist had to hand draw everything. And so, of course, the art field was up in arms about this phenomenon because many people felt that it was cheating rather than a faster way to do something. So here you have a device where the camera obscura is projected onto a sheet of paper, and you see this artist tracing. It's a tracing mechanism. It was also used at seaside resorts for entertainment. So very large structures were built, and the light would come through. And by now, people discovered that if you added an actual glass lens, you could see the image better. And so they built these roadside attractions where you could pull over and go to the beach and take a look at the camera obscura. And we have one in San Francisco. If you ever come to San Francisco, make sure to visit the giant camera obscura. So you walk inside, the lens is here, and it rotates slowly, 360 degrees, and it projects this image onto a white disc. And it's the highest resolution image you'll ever see in your life. I sure wish we could make a picture that looks like that, but there's no way we could because there are no sensors involved. It's pure nature, and it's really awesome. And so inventors really thought, wow, if we could build a camera obscura and we could put something in the back of it that would fix the image permanently, this would really save a lot of time. And so this Frenchman named Joseph Nicephore Niepce, if you say that 5 times, Nicephore Niepce, you can call him Niepce, worked on this in the 1800s, 1826. He actually started his experiments in 1816, but he fell victim to a tragic story. This is an etching of him. His son was a graphic artist, a very good one, and so he was inspired by the etching process, where you take a metal plate, you scratch into it, you ink it, and you put it on a press with ink and roll it and make several variations of the same artwork. He thought, wouldn't it be great if we could build a camera that did that? And so he did in 1826. The problem was that this exposure, how long he had to leave the camera in front of the window, made an image that wasn't that great of a quality because it was in front of the window for something like 10 to 15 hours. So the shadows moved. So what you're looking at is a 15-hour exposure where the shadows have moved, and what you're looking at is a view out his window, but it's not very good quality. And so what he did is, it's not unlike the etching process we know today. He took a plate, he coated it with bitumen of Judea, which is asphalt. He put the camera obscura in front of the window with the plate in the back of the camera. He opened up the lens, the light passed through, he left it there for 15 hours, and the areas that hardened remained embossed or debossed, and the areas that didn't, he washed away. So he made a natural etching plate, which he then inked and created this. So this is considered to be the very first photograph, even though it doesn't use any chemicals. It actually uses traditional etching materials. It's considered to be the first photograph because it used a camera obscura. Here's a contemporary view out the window of his home called Le Gras, which is in a very small town called Saint-Loup-de-Varennes in France. Unfortunately, the discovery that Niepce was the first inventor of photography was buried because he also invented the steam engine for boats. He was an inventor, not a photographer. Back in the 19th century, people were working on all kinds of things. The history of the bicycle and the history of photography are parallel. So when I went to this museum, I saw a bicycle that he'd been working on, and it had wooden wheels and a horse's saddle. It was pretty wild. But he basically went broke trying to become rich, and his invention of the first photograph was buried until about the 1950s, until somebody unearthed it. He had formed a partnership with a very ostentatious and outgoing Louis-Jacques Monde Daguerre. And Daguerre was in the theater. He painted large backdrops because this is before electricity. So they would build these very, very large outdoor theaters where the light could filter through and illuminate the background. They're called the diorama in France. And that's what he worked on. So he was artistic, he was outgoing, he was not necessarily a great businessman, but he learned about Niepce's work, and they started working together on the invention of what would become photography that was recognized. During this time, however, Niepce died, probably of the common flu. We don't really know, probably something that could have been easily cured today. But he died, and so Daguerre took over and followed through and released what became known as the invention of photography in 1839, and he named it after himself. It's called the daguerreotype. Meanwhile, in England, Henry Fox Talbot was working on another process, a positive-negative process. We're not going to really talk about that one, but it did exist. And then this gentleman here, Sir John Herschel, without him, none of this could have happened because he invented the mixture, the hyposulfate mixture, which would clear away the light-sensitive particles and leave us with a fixed photograph. A photograph that could be seen even though we turned the light on. And you can still find daguerreotypes and calotypes today from the 1800s thanks to the invention by John Herschel. John Herschel also coined the term photography. Photography means writing with light. Photos means light, graphy means to write. So these are the three very important people in addition to Niepce. However, Daguerre really took all the credit. Daguerre was interested in fame and fortune. So he went to the French government and he said, I've invented the world's first photograph and I will let you have it. You can give it to the world. In exchange, I would like an estate in the country and a lifelong salary. And they said, sure. And he didn't live very much long after that. So the French took credit for the invention of photography, even though the English Fox Talbot had been working on his own invention. And they said, we are going to give photography to the world. Except for you, England, you're going to have to pay a handsome fee because, you know, there's this ongoing rivalry between England and France. And so they did. And so what happened is that missionaries from all over the world went out. One Frenchman went to Mauritius and started a daguerreotype studio. And while we're in Mauritius, we're going to visit their very small history of photography, and we're going to see these early daguerreotypes of the island. And I'm super excited. I get goosebumps. But the daguerreotype was gorgeous. Why? Because it looked like a mirror that had been etched. The nickname was a mirror with a memory. It was a little jewel-like object placed in a velvet case, and it had a leather exterior, and you can open and close it. And it was very precious. They modeled the case after portraiture painting. But the problem was that it was one of a kind, so you couldn't reproduce it. The other problem was that it required very long exposures. This is a street in Paris. This street might have had hundreds of people walking on it, except that this picture is supposed to be, or supposedly, the first picture of a human being, because this particular person stopped to get their shoe shined, so they were the only ones in the image not moving. And this is a portrait by Daguerre looking out of the streets of Paris. Many people speculate that he posed the person here. I don't know if that's true or not. But, he was kind of fantastical that way. So the daguerreotype became madly popular. It made its way to the United States. People on the East Coast opened up studios. They thought they could become very wealthy by making portraits. Portraits were still expensive, though. And there were these torture devices that helped you sit still, because you would have to sit very still for sometimes 10 minutes in order to get your picture made. And little children in pictures were perfect when they were sleeping. So that's an old trick, is to warm up the studio, swaddle the baby in blankets, and as soon as they're asleep, start making the pictures. And so that trick was used here. It also becomes interesting because it's the first time really that we see portraits of African American people around the Civil War era in daguerreotypes is unusual. And this is Civil War, era America, where sometimes people thought of their indentured servants as parts of the family, so would have their portraits made. And so this really swept the nation. And so people were focused more on the daguerreotype than they were on that positive-negative process in England, probably because the world simply did not understand the concept of reproducibility. They were used to painting, so they were used to purchasing something that was one of a kind. And so thanks to increased lens strength, the light could pass through more quickly. You didn't have to sit for a daguerreotype as long as 10 minutes. You could sit shorter lengths of time. And so here's a daguerreotype studio. Look at that tripod. It's like basically made out of the trunk of a tree. It's gorgeous. So anybody that could afford a daguerreotype got one made. Daguerreotypes cost anywhere between 1 month and 2 month wage. So you still don't see lower class or lower middle class being depicted in photography in the mid-1800s. Not until some cheaper alternatives came about, which we won't talk about. But the daguerreotype, you can still do a search on eBay and find many, many of these, because in the first year they were released, it's speculated that something like 50,000 daguerreotypes were made in the United States in 1 year. So it was just, this craze that swept the nation. And people would dress very finely for them. They would carry around objects that were sentimental. So here is a daguerreotype of her husband, probably deceased, in the photograph with her. Those that were literate would bring in books. Those that were religious would bring in religious books. And so it becomes this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to have a likeness made. And people did. They called it a likeness, not a photograph. And it swept the nation. They were very toxic to make, and they required you to be very specialized in the field. So the most toxic chemical is mercury. Mercury fumed over hot candles was used to fix the image. That's pretty intense. Mercury is very carcinogenic. So perhaps photographers didn't live very long back in this day. And so the first documentary photographs that we see are actually daguerreotypes, mostly of very, very extravagant pieces of architecture and locations such as Niagara Falls. Niagara Falls is was a huge hotspot for 19th century photography. Anything that was magical, crazy, historically important, or was photographed, or people, but not just everyday scenes. A daguerreotype would never be wasted on something like that because it was too intense to make. To travel and make daguerreotypes was really difficult because of all the chemicals I just talked about. You also had to coat the plate in the dark, and it wasn't just any kind of a plate. It was a copper plate with pure silver plated on top, and then highly, highly polished to get that mirror-like look and feel, okay? And then, so we have these people setting out, mostly French artists. Larabor, Noël Marie Paiement Larabor, led a group of excursion artists to make daguerreotypes all over France to celebrate the national heritage sites of France. And then they brought them back and they were going to make a book. However, this was a problem. Why couldn't you make a book? There was no way to reproduce a daguerreotype. So for a long, long time, daguerreotype artists would bring the photographs, hand them to the artist engraver, and the engraver would re-engrave the photograph on a metal plate that could be inked and put through a machine. So this whole book had to be re-illustrated by artists who were copying the photograph, and that's how they made books for a long, long time. So, this went on for a good 11 years. The daguerreotype pretty much took over for a good 11 years until finally somebody else invented something a little bit easier to deal with. So Frederick Scott Archer invented the wet plate collodion process. And what's interesting is, just like I showed you Abe Morell's picture of the camera obscura, there is an interesting backlash against digital photography, and a lot of artists are re-exploring these 19th century processes because they have so much handmade integrity to them. So you'll see a lot of artists doing wet plate and daguerreotype processes. But this was still a problem because if you wanted to do a wet plate collodion, the negative, it was a negative positive process. So finally the world was ready for that. But the negative was made out of glass. And the other problem was that there was no electricity, so it's not like you could take this negative and make it really large. If you wanted a really large picture, you had to put a really large plate of glass on your mule and hike out to Yosemite National Park where there were no roads. And that's what these people did, okay? Once they got to the field, one of the most famous American wet plate collodion artists is William Henry Jackson. This is an actual etching of him and his mule with his camera on the side. Okay, so it has his camera on the side of the mule and as many sheets of glass and all of his chemistry. There was no plastic back in this day either. So all of the chemistry that he brought was in a glass bottle. So they would set up this tent. They would take the glass, they would mix the chemistry, and they would coat the plate on location. That's why it was called wet plate. Then they'd have about 5 minutes to put it in the camera and make an exposure. Bugs would fly in and get stuck in places where the temperatures were really hot. The collodion would bubble and boil. And so you'll see a lot of wet plate collodion images you'll see on the edge. It's kind of a mess. And that trend has found its way into Instagram. So you know how you can add rough edges in Instagram? Everything that's in Instagram is rooted and inspired by old historical processes. We became accustomed to them and we like them. And so they made them into an Instagram filter. So here's William Henry Jackson with his big-ass camera. It's not really called a big-ass camera. It's called a mammoth camera. This is like a 20 by 30 inch camera with a sheet of glass that he's brought out to, he photographed a lot in the West. So I'm assuming that this is somewhere either in the Midwest or in the Southwest. And he probably did dress up for this picture. So in the United States, wet plate collodion became very, very popular because of the timing. If you know something about U.S. history, you know that in the mid-1800s, there were a lot of land surveys. The U.S. government was interested in expanding the railroads to meet the West and the East, those railroads meeting in Salt Lake, Utah, finally, so that you could travel instead of by covered wagon, which would take several months. You could travel from the East Coast to the West Coast in 5 days, which is completely unheard of. So ahead of the railroad construction workers, the U.S. government sent these survey photographers to survey the land for the railroads, but also to survey the land to see if they could be occupied. And they photographed Native American people that would become displaced. All right, so How would they, then they had the negatives, how would they make the prints? Have you ever heard of a photographer's omelet? It's made out of only egg yolks because the whites were used to mix with the light-sensitive material to coat the paper to make the print. And so they would mostly make these pieces of paper. You could buy them pre-coated, or you could coat your own. It would have to sit in a cool place for like 3 days and get really nice and smelly. Then you could put it on the paper. Then you'd put your glass negative on top, clamp it together so that it was nice and tight, and put it out in the sun. Again, because there was no electricity. So if you see an albumin print when we go to Mauritius, just know that the albumin print was the same size as the negative and that there was no electricity involved in making the image. And here's an example of, the prints also look kind of yellow. Okay? You guys doing okay? You want to get up and stretch for a minute? It's hot in here, isn't it? All right, so I'm going to fire through. So here are, basically, it's the wet plate collodion and albumin process that made travel and exploration photography possible. That combined with the steam engine in boats and railroads. Photographers could get around. And so you had particular photographers who were famous for particular places. This is before the time that we traveled wherever we wanted to. So this particular person, Francis Firth, was very, very well known for his work in Egypt. So the early pictures of Egypt, nobody had ever really gone there before from the West, or from the UK for that matter, were made by him. When you see pictures of Egypt, there's just a hand, from this time period, there's only really a handful of people that actually made them. And these are those albumin prints. They're very delicate. You might see cracks in them. They're only viewable under low light. Felix Bito photographed Japan. Imagine seeing Japan for the first time. How many of you have been to Japan? Lucky. I've never been to Japan before. But imagine the first Westerner seeing Japan. And these photographs created a craze for what we refer to as Orientalism, in that people from France and people from England, these kinds of images made people want to travel to Japan, and they brought back artwork and furnishings, and they decorated their homes, their entire rooms in French homes that were Oriental furnishings and wallpaper and things. And the other thing that photographers did is they implemented this idea of hand coloring, like Japanese art and Chinese art is oftentimes hand colored with this muted color to try and kind of give the sense of color. So Felix had a brother who also photographed, but who photographed mostly in India. And for a long time, art historians were perplexed. They couldn't figure out how one person could be in both places at the same time. And then they figured out that they were a pair of brothers. So he used the wet plate process, this very cumbersome process. You know, I like to imagine that they used mules, but in fact, they often hired servants in countries that they were in, to Sherpas, if you will, to help them carry around this very, very heavy equipment. It's not just documentary for fun. During this time period, documentary photography was used to investigate colonizing particular countries, and in this case, propaganda, to justify the opium wars in the East. So I'll flip through some of the pictures. Samurai. So he photographed extensively throughout Asia, China, Japan, Korea. And these are some of the earliest pictures we've ever seen from these countries. Yes, you can hand color in Lightroom if you want to create and mimic Bito's images. So what was happening in what was then called the Near East, or Asia, and also parts of the Middle East in photography were different than what was happening in the West. It was really about monuments and people in the East, and in the West, there were no monuments yet, and there weren't a lot of people yet, except for the Native American people. So in the West, you see images of gorgeous landscapes and native people. Unfortunately, for the same purposes as, to use kind of as propaganda to encourage people to move west, and also to depict the Native Americans that were there. This is Timothy O'Sullivan. He was an Irishman who was hired on the Hayden survey. So a lot of geographers were hired to map the lands, and they would send a photographer along. Has anybody ever been to Canyon de Chelly in Arizona? It's awesome. If you're ever driving through Arizona, make sure you go through here. Because it's a reservation and a national park, it looks the same today as it did in 1873. My beloved Yosemite, kind of near where I live. Anybody been to Yosemite? Pretty magical, yeah? Imagine going there on a donkey with glass plates to make a picture, a mammoth plate picture, and coming back. And the master of that was Carleton Watkins, pre-Ansel Adams. Edward Muybridge, another famous Bay Area photographers who photographed Yosemite. They also made what are called stereo cards, these 3D images, but I didn't bring any examples of that. So mammoth plate photographers were making these for galleries, hoping to sell them as art. And then the stereo cards were for the average person to collect as tourist treats. Anybody ever heard of this guy? Edward Curtis. So he's probably the most famous photographer for photographing Native Americans, but his view was very, very flawed. Then he wanted to make an encyclopedia of what he called the disappearing race, because he acknowledged and saw that Native American populations were dwindling and that their existence was threatened. But he wasn't a humanitarian. You have to think about the 19th century and how people were not conservationists in the 19th century. They believed in manifest destiny, and they believed that their occupation would help the poor, stupid, uneducated Native Americans, right? So he wanted to document the disappearing race, but it wasn't about helping them. It was really just about making beautiful pictures and that he could kind of profit from. It's not that he didn't care, it's that his mindset, the mindset of conservation, just wasn't quite there yet. And J.P. Morgan fronted the project. The other reason why Curtis's images are flawed is that he believed in staging and he wanted a particular look and feel. It's called a pictorialist look and feel. Very idealized Native American people. So if Native Americans started to implement Western dress, he would make them take it off. If Native Americans didn't have a big enough headdress that was impressive enough for the picture, he'd loan one to them that was from another tribe. So Native American people have said they're very thankful for Curtis's image, but they also recognize that they're pretty inaccurate. So here we have an example of this clock, this westernized clock, which he retouched out of the image. So you could do a lot of Photoshop-y things before Photoshop because you had those big glass plates. You would retouchers would paint over the top of them to get rid of things they didn't like. So here are the idealized and very beautiful views. And he made these as many different kinds of processes. Photogravure, which was a photomechanical process, you could reproduce 25 images from a photogravure plate. These are the most common ones that you'll see. Do these look familiar to anybody? You see them on postcards. If you ever drive up 101 and you stop at the Paul Bunyan, has anybody stopped at the Talking Paul Bunyan on 101? If you get a chance to stop there, it's pretty hysterical. It's on This American Life. But they also have a collection of Edward Curtis prints in there. They have a small Native American museum in there. Okay, so far I haven't shown you anything that has anything to do with social activism. Really, it's about surveys, about not even about preservation, but just about documenting for purposes of handing over the documents to the government. this is one of the very early social documentary photographers. And he actually wasn't a photographer. So people didn't really think of photography so much to implement into activism until a little later. And he's one of the early ones, Jacob Riis. So he was actually a police reporter in New York. And he hated that New York didn't have a healthy, safe place to put its immigrants. The immigrants were living in very dirty, poor slums, often many, many families to a room. They would have to sleep in shifts. And he thought that the government should intervene. And it's because of this photo essay, really, that kind of the concept of Section 8 housing or the concept of building housing for the poor became prevalent. So he wanted to expose the poor conditions and the slums where people were living. And this is in the 1890s. So he's still using, now they have dry plates, but these are still glass negatives. So they figured out a way to commercially make negatives so you wouldn't have to do the wet process, but they're still very cumbersome cameras. He was one of the first photographers to implement the flash. Back then, the flash was literally gunpowder that exploded to illuminate the room because these rooms were so dark and terrible. And his work culminated in a book called How the Other Half Lives, and he showed it to the upper class in order to try and get them to implement laws and change the way that immigrants were treated and housed. The first really social documentary photographer. This changed in 1857, so up until 1857, pictures had to be re-engraved with the halftone dot, which is what all of you have in your physical textbooks. Now photographs could finally be put in newspapers. So this kind of birthed the concept of the photo essay. So the halftone dot was really important in disseminating images in newspapers. This, and in the 1890s, dry plate film you could buy, commercially sold. And Eastman Kodak decided to give out their snapshot camera for free and to sell it cheaply. So all of a sudden, in the 1890s, right before the turn of the century, more and more people are making photographs with smaller and smaller cameras. Okay? So this was huge. Also, flexible film was invented, film on gelatin, so it wasn't glass anymore. So it was easier, and they would actually advertise towards homemakers and children. So photography became way more prevalent right before the 19th century. So you see documentary images pick up right about the turn of the century. Okay? You have crazy cameras. Smaller and smaller cameras. Actually, photography was highly criticized in the same way it is today. Like with your iPhone, you can take a picture of anything and nobody really pays attention. Privacy was an issue. People were freaked out about the camera. And you see right here, it's in a detective's hat, which is pretty funny. Amateur photography, thanks to the Brownie camera, you make the pictures, we do the rest. You could buy the camera preloaded with 100 sheets of film, send it back to Kodak. They'd reload it, process the images, and send them to you. So photography then was made easy. And you could buy a camera for $25. Finally, though, it was the invention of the Leica in the 1900s, or 1905, that got serious photographers excited. Motion picture film had been invented. Thomas Edison invented the sprocket so that motion picture could happen. So the sprocket is now invented so you can actually do rolls of film and you can do smaller cameras. Electricity is available now, so you can photograph with smaller cameras and make enlargements. So a lot happened at the turn of the century. With a smaller camera, the camera becomes an extension of the hand. And so instead of these architectural shots or these street scenes where nobody's there because the exposure is so long, everybody becomes a ghost, materials are better and faster, and you can make these kinds of decisive moment images. This is Henri Cartier-Bresson. This is the image that's famous for its decisive moment kind of look and feel. We okay? I know, we're really rocking back and forth. And Henri Cartier-Bresson was really inspired by the Dada and Surrealist movement experiments. If you look at paintings from this time period, they're abstract and they have these forms very similar to his documentary photography. So he was in France. So America versus France, different kinds of subject matter. Henri Cartier-Bresson was a street photographer, right? These moments. Whereas Louis Hine was a social activist. So Louis Hine was not a photographer. He was similar to Jacob Riis. He wanted to show the things that needed to be corrected using photography and social activism. He was actually a sociologist, and he worked with the Child Labor Committee. And over the next decade, thanks to him, these images were responsible for implementing the 40-hour-a-week work week, the 15-minute break, and you had to be 15 years old or older to get a job. So his images really changed the way that the labor market in the United States operated. Here we have children in factories. Entire families were hired, men for heavy labor, women and children for lighter work. Work days ran from dawn to sunset, resulting in a 68 to 72-hour work week. Many families also lived in company-owned houses, bought company-owned goods from the store. Thus, they lived their lives entirely dominated by their employers. Hine used tricks to go into factories to photograph, sometimes because factory owners were profiting greatly from the use of illegal child labor. Now, there were laws against child labor, but people were doing it anyway. There was no way to police this. He said that he was, as well as taking pictures, he would make notes about their ages. He learned to measure the height of the children by knowing how high up the buttons on his coat were. When he wasn't able to get into the workplace, he would photograph children coming home or going to work. And when he photographed the areas, they were fairly dark, so he would use what's called a wide opening or a wide lens aperture, which means shallow depth of field. So you'll see in his images, particularly the one at the end, where the subject is in focus, the background is out of focus. This has to do with that it was a dark environment. He used his pictures in leaflets, magazine articles, and lectures that shed light on the terrible working conditions to which children were being subjected to. The goal, again, was to change policy on child labor and the work week. He was always an educator. He believed that if people were shown clear evidence of what was happening by the use of his pictures, they would understand the situation and would want to change it. Here we have child minors. Barefoot newspaper delivery boys. This looks really safe. Let's get up on the mill barefoot. Here's an example where he said, "Honey, would you just stand next to the mill there so that I can just get a measurement of how high it is? I'd like to put you there for scale. I'm here photographing the machinery." So he would lie, right? You see how she's standing there very perfectly doing her duty? In the United States, the Great Depression created a whole group of photographers, thanks to Frederick D. Roosevelt. President Roosevelt, FDR, all of his projects were designed to get people back to work. He also was rearranging the way that the American farmer behaved. Did anybody see Ken Burns' The Dust Bowl? Is anybody from the Midwest or from areas that were affected by the Dust Bowl in the 1930s? No. So this is the Great Depression. Areas of Oklahoma had been overfarmed, creating these huge kick-up in dust. People had to leave. Cows died. People suffocated. They couldn't breathe the air. They had to relocate, yes.
Am I making this up, or is Ken Burns like a type of effect on like?
Ken Burns is a documentary photographer, and they have named a filter after him on iMovie. Yes, that's correct. Okay. That push-pull is the Ken Burns effect. That's right. So FDR decided to employ documentary photographers to go out and see how farmers were doing. He hired a man named Roy Stryker to assemble a team. This team of photographers became some of the most famous photographers during this time period, and we all own the images. So if you go to the Library of Congress and you type in one of these names, you can download a high-res image and use it however you like. So it was a taxpayer project, and it turned into a 9-year documentary project where these photographers spread out all over the United States to produce what became known as a visual encyclopedia of American life. So it started out that they would document farmers, but it ended up that they documented all kinds of things: class systems, racism, general conditions of the Great Depression in the United States. One of the most famous people is Dorothea Lange. How many people have seen this picture? Yeah, it's a very iconic image of a woman who is with her 2 children. The children, they're living off of birds and small animals that the children have killed. And Dorothea Lange was originally a portrait photographer in San Francisco. So during this time period, if you had any photographic skill, you were employed to go out and do photographs. And the same with the Civil War period. You had photographers who made portraits, and then all of a sudden they were photographing the Civil War. So newspapers ran these images thanks to the halftone dot, and it became a huge phenomenon that, thanks to photography and also audio recordings of this time period, the United States began to understand the conditions of its farmers and its poverty. These are all images by Dorothea Lange. They're ironic. A lot of the signs don't match the economy of the time period at all. What I like is, if you look at the way that documentary photographs are made, we start out with a wide view, like an aerial view of the city, and then you start getting smaller and smaller and smaller. You see the detail of these hands. It's a very typical formula in documentary photography. Cars would break down, people would leave them. They'd sell the tires, they'd get what money they could, and they would leave them on the side of the road. After the Great Depression, Dorothea Lange won the very prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship, which today gives artists $40,000 roughly to leave their work for a year and work on a long-term documentary project. But she refused it because she believed strongly that she needed to be working against this concept of Japanese internment during World War II. So in World War II, Japanese Americans were imprisoned in camps because they were seen as threats against the US government. And in San Francisco, we had a camp, and she felt very strongly she needed to stay and photograph this. And her photographs were censored, and she was asked to stop, and she didn't. So that's why she sent back the Guggenheim, because she really didn't feel like she could get any support from the government. She didn't want the money. And these have become some of the most important documents of that time period. And then eventually, she and Ansel Adams founded the San Francisco Art Institute photography program in 1945. And I have taught at the San Francisco Art Institute. Walker Evans was another FSA, or Farm Security Administration, photographer. This is also a well-known image. His images culminated into a book called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. And Gordon Parks was another really important Farm Security Administrator photographer, the only African-American photographer, who eventually was sent to the South by Roy Stryker. Roy Stryker kind of wanted him to put him in this situation of feeling discriminated against. It was different climate than California, and he really wanted him to respond through pictures. This is a very famous image. It refers to that famous painting, American Gothic, but it's actually a janitorial worker in a school. He photographed all over the world. But he's very famous for his portraits of African American people and in the West. Okay, so we have 4 minutes left. There's a lot more to see, but I'm gonna hold us to our 4 o'clock time slot. After the Great Depression, this was the golden age of photojournalism. A lot of documentary photographers think that this age will never exist again. I disagree. I think new media, multimedia, is an exciting place for documentary photographers. But unfortunately, a lot of the magazines that ran picture essays folded because they couldn't figure out a profitable model, right? Life magazine, that's no longer. They only come out with special editions now. Margaret Bourke-White was a female photographer who got the first cover of Life magazine. Here she is sitting on the Chrysler Building making a picture with this huge camera. She was also sent to wartime Russia, which was very unusual for a female photographer. And she was sent all over the United States to photograph the Industrial Revolution. And these were the pictures that wound up in Life magazine. This is the cover of Life magazine, the first cover in 1936. So in America, there were a lot of issues in regards to the economy and farming and trying to stabilize the economy. In Europe, it was quite different. Eugene Auger was a Parisian photographer, an early street photographer, who photographed Paris before the Haussmann regime. So I don't know if you guys know this, but they really destroyed most of Paris and rebuilt it to make way for the automobile, to widen the boulevards. And so medieval Paris, a lot of medieval Paris was torn down. And so he photographed much of Paris before the turn of the century when it was torn down to make way for the grand boulevards like the Champs-Élysées. So sometimes you don't know it, but your images become important documents merely because the times have changed. And I think it's interesting to think about that as we go forward to these countries. You might hear people say, oh, well, it used to be like this and it used to be like that. You're going to be saying that 20, 30, 40 years from now. So the photographs that you create are really bookmarks in time. This is your present. This is your old-fashioned Japan. If you can think of it that way, when you're making images like this that could feel sentimental in 20, 30, 40 years. Because things are changing very, very quickly in a lot of these places that we're going to. So just the little details, the baskets and things that people use, these are all important documents. The structures that may not, exist, the way that people live and their traditions are changing very rapidly. Those are, as we look at some of these countries, and just to wrap it up, I want to show you some contemporary stuff, because I showed you a lot of old stuff. I'll flip through quick. So Jim Goldberg is a Magnum photographer. The Magnum agency was named after a Magnum of champagne. It was a celebratory name to celebrate the end of World War II. After World War II, photographers thought, we're going to cut out the middleman. We want to become our own agency and sell our own pictures so that we can profit. And so the Magnum agency still exists today in Paris and in New York. So he is a Magnum photographer. And it's full of men and women from around the globe, deceased and living. One of his most famous series is a series called Raised by Wolves, where he lived with homeless kids. What I like about his pictures is that it implements journal handwriting from the people that he photographs and ephemera. So I'm going to encourage you to photograph, either with your DSLRs or your iPhones, writings from your journal to implement into your slideshow presentations, and ephemera. What's ephemera? Found objects, things, souvenirs or pieces of paper, ticket stubs that you might bring along the way. He also uses all kinds of cameras. These are Polaroids, and he combines them in layouts with traditional black and white imagery. These are writings by the street kids. And so he often implements writings by the people that he's photographing. He'll also photograph objects that the people are using. This is a skateboard from one of the kids. This is a jean jacket from one of the kids. Here's a journal from one of the kids. And then he'll take all of these and mix them up together to create these interesting layouts. So you can get creative. You don't have to be so straightforward in your work. And then finally, last, we have sound, photography, and video as combination. And this is where it gets pretty fun. I don't know how the sound is on this thing, but I want to show you, it's about a minute long, and then we'll be done. Can you guys hear it?
You can understand why people want to jump in. It's alluring. It's been described as, sort of haunting, as calling people. In the same way that passion calls us. In the velvet night at Marana Hotel, Marana, I kissed the yellowish soles of her long-toed feet. I immolated myself. But it was all of no avail. Both doomed were we.
He's using a mammoth camera to make these pictures, 8x10 negatives.
It's a place where we have affairs. It's a place where kids go for their first time, that sort of thing. It's also where people go on their honeymoon. These hotel rooms are not glamorous, and that's part of the sadness, is that a honeymoon, we think should be the most special thing in the world, but it's just this room that's been used over and over again, and there's something sad about this. I think these pictures are more related to a love song on the radio than they are to a documentary study on love. So they evoke a feeling, and I wanted that kind of pained and passionate feeling.
And it is all around. It is near.
You have to go understand.
We all know.
So this is more contemporary. He's narrating his own experience. He's inserting his own opinion about Niagara Falls or about the place. So if you're taking a journal, write these things down. You can implement them into a voiceover if you want. Optional.
Are you there in my arms? Are you there in my heart? Will it be alright tonight?
Next time, bring your cameras, okay? We'll go outside and make some pictures, get out of this hot air. No, you don't need your computers. Bye.
How are you? So we don't have to do the assignment one yet.
No,
Just do the
you
readings.
look at it.
Okay.
Okay, look at it. Bring your cameras and your grade cards.
Okay.
All right, we'll work on it together, all right?
Okay.
Bye, guys.
I was not able to get the Lightroom downloaded before I got shit.
Okay, we need to do